He locked the bathroom door and held his son so tight he couldn't breathe. Outside, someone pounded on the metal. Inside, Gardner prayed the night would end. The floor was cold. The air smelled like bleach and fear. Chris sat with his back against the door, one foot braced like a wedge, like his body could stop the world from breaking in. His son, Christopher, curled up on his lap, half asleep, trusting him like this was normal. Chris stared at the dim light above them and tried not to cry. Because if he cried, his son might wake up. And if his son woke up, he might ask the question Chris couldn't answer. "Dad, when are we going home?" But there was no home. Not tonight. Not anymore. Just a man, a child, and a locked bathroom in a subway station, pretending it was a bedroom. And the worst part? Tomorrow morning, Chris still had to show up, in a suit, and act like he belonged in a world that didn't want him. It didn't start with a big dream. It started with a mistake. Chris had bet everything on these heavy medical scanners, machines he thought hospitals would need. They were expensive, hard to sell. And every time he carried one into a building, it felt like carrying a brick made of bad decisions. He'd walk into clinics with a smile that hurt his face. "Just a minute of your time." But the doors kept closing. The bills kept stacking. The rent came due like a threat. At home, the air was always tight. Linda's patience was running out, stretched thin by double shifts and empty cupboards. She wasn't cruel, she was tired. Kind of tired that turns love into anger. Chris would promise, I'm trying. But trying didn't pay the landlord. Trying didn't keep the lights on. One night, the argument didn't end. It snapped. Linda packed. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was hard. "I can't do this anymore." Chris watched her leave, and something inside him dropped. Not just his marriage, his safety net. Now it was just him and his son, and Chris made a choice that would either save them or crush them. He saw a man step out of a red sports car, laughing like life was easy. Chris couldn't stop staring. The man looked like he belonged to a different planet, one where people didn't count coins at the grocery store. Chris walked up, heart pounding. "What do you do? And how do you do it?" The man smiled like it was nothing. "I'm a stockbroker." That word hit Chris like a door opening. Stockbroker. Not a miracle, not a lottery ticket, a path. So Chris chased it. He applied for an internship at a brokerage firm, one of those places with glass walls and quiet confidence, the kind of place where people shook hands like they owned the air. But there was a catch. The internship didn't pay. Not $1, and only one intern would get hired at the end. So Chris was signing up for a race where losing meant his son had nowhere to sleep. Still, he walked in anyway. He wore a suit that looked like it had been through a war. He smiled too much. He spoke fast, like if he slowed down, someone would notice the panic underneath. They tested him, watched him, measured him, and somehow he got in. Now his days became a tightrope. Every morning he dropped Christopher off at daycare with a grin that tried to hide the truth. "Have a good day, buddy." Then he ran. Not walked. Ran. Because every second mattered. He had to call more clients than anyone else, learn faster than anyone else, sound confident, even when his stomach was empty. But life didn't care about his effort. His bank account hit zero, then went negative. Then the landlord came. Chris stood in the apartment, holding his son's hand, while strangers carried their things out like it was trash. The bed, the clothes, the last pieces of normal. Christopher looked up at him, confused. "Dad, where are they taking our stuff?" Chris swallowed hard. "We're moving." That night, they didn't move into a new place. They moved into the streets. Chris tried shelters. Lines wrapped around buildings like snakes. If you were late, you lost your spot. If you lost your spot, you slept outside. So Chris learned a new routine. He learned which churches served dinner, which shelters opened first, which corners were safest, which bathrooms had locks. And every day, he still showed up at that office. Clean shirt, straight face, like he wasn't carrying his whole life in his arms. But the pressure kept rising, and one day, Chris got arrested over unpaid parking tickets he couldn't afford. He sat in a cell, staring at the wall, knowing every hour in there was an hour. He wasn't calling clients, and An hour he wasn't proving himself, an hour closer to losing everything. When they finally let him out, he didn't go home. He didn't have one. He sprinted to daycare, breathless, terrified his son would be gone. Christopher was still there. Small and patient, like he'd been waiting his whole life, Chris scooped him up, whispering, "I'm here." But even that night, there was nowhere to go, so they ended up in that subway station bathroom. Chris held the door shut while his son slept on his lap, and tears finally came. Silent, hot, ashamed, not because he was weak, because he was trying so hard. The next morning, the city didn't care what happened in that bathroom. The sun rose. Chris washed his face in a sink, smoothed his hair, adjusted his tie, then walked into the office, and the game continued. The internship was brutal. Phones ringing, men in suits moving like sharks. Chris had to be sharper, faster, better, while carrying a secret no one could know. Because if they knew he was homeless, they might decide he was a risk. And Chris couldn't afford to be a risk. So he worked like a man on fire. He didn't take long lunches. He didn't waste time. He studied at night while his son slept. He made calls with a voice that sounded calm, even when his hands shook. He started landing meetings. Small wins at first. A returned call, a polite conversation. A maybe. Then bigger. A client who listened. A client who trusted him. And slowly, the impossible started to crack. But the final test wasn't about numbers. It was about who Chris was when everything was against him. One day, he got called into a room. The kind of room where decisions get made quietly. The kind of room that can change your life in one sentence. Chris sat down trying to breathe normally. The men across from him looked at papers, then at him. A pause, a long one. Chris felt his heart slam against his ribs. If they said no, he didn't just lose a job. He lost the future he'd been promising his son. Finally, one of them spoke. "Chris, we'd like to offer you a position." For a second, Chris didn't move, like his brain couldn't accept it. Then it hit him. He got it. He actually got it. His face tried to stay professional, but it broke anyway. His eyes filled. His mouth trembled. He shook their hands like he was holding onto the edge of a cliff. He walked out of the building, and the world looked different. Not because the streets changed, because he did. He stepped into the sunlight, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't pretending. He walked, slow and steady, tears rolling down his face, smiling like a man who just survived something no one saw. And the truth was simple. Chris Gardner didn't become a millionaire because life was fair. He became one because even when he had nothing, no money, no home, no help, he still showed up. For his son, for his promise, for the life he refused to let go of. And somewhere in that city, a little boy held his father's hand, not knowing the full story, only knowing one thing that mattered.
Dad came back. If you want more stories like this, like, comment, share, and subscribe.